Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined in the studio at a careful social distance by Effie Samara, who is a writer and academic at the University of Glasgow. Effie, how are you this morning?
Hello, I'm good, thank you.
And we're joined via Skype from home by Dave Doogan MP, the MP for Angus. And Dave, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Kenny.
Excellent. Well, we start today, as we always do, with a quick update on the coronavirus statistics at the moment. This is as of yesterday. Obviously, today's statistics will be announced just a wee bit later this afternoon. But as of 2 p.m. yesterday, a total of 136,146 people in Scotland have been tested. Of those, 120,416 were confirmed negative and 15,730 tests were positive. There were 582 people in hospital with suspected or confirmed COVID last night, 13 of whom were in intensive care, and another 7 had suspected COVID-19 in intensive care. And sadly, 2,447 patients who have tested positive in hospitals have now sadly died from the illness. So that is where we stand with numbers just now. But we start off with the Equality and Human Rights Commission this week announced that it would be investigating the hostile environment and the Windrush Scandal, two issues that have, I was going to say plagued the Home Office, but this is Home Office policy and has been for some years. There's been no indication that the Tories plan to end it. So Dave, if I could start with you, what was your reaction when you heard that the Equalities and Human Rights Commission was going to start looking into this issue?
Well, I'm not surprised, and I'm very grateful that they are. I think it's very easy when you're living through these subjects to be shocked when you initially hear about them, and then it just becomes part of the news cycle. But both of these elements, which are products of UK government policy, are shocking, literally shocking. And sometimes I think it's important to be able to take that step back and just reframe what it must have felt like to have in any way, to all intents and purposes, to be, in terms of Windrush, to be a British citizen, paying your taxes, contributing to society, and then to be told not only that you weren't that, but you had to get out. It beggars belief. It's simply, and it's, there's no question about the underlying imperative to get right underneath this scandal and expose the decisions and the flaws which led to it. And the same applies to the hostile environment scenario as well, which is a blight.
Mm-hmm. I should have said just before we got into this story, if you at home want to get involved in the conversation here, you can do so. You can follow us on Twitter at BroadcastScot, and you can join the conversation using the hashtag FullScottish. We will be flashing some of those tweets up on the screen during the show. So do please get involved. Let us know what you think. But Effie, this whole situation, the hostile environment, how is it that a policy like this, which has had such a damaging effect on not just the people involved, but on industries as well? There are specific industries that have been hit hard by this drive to demonise immigrants. Well, what do you think is behind this idea?
Well, behind it is, I think, in my humble opinion, two things: ideology and money. The interesting thing is that it isn't to the financial benefit of, as we say, of the many. There are, I hate to use this phrase, but there are dark forces at play here which will benefit from this particular ideology, and this is sadly who is leading the debate today in Westminster and within the administration at Westminster. So you have all these different ideologies. You have the ideologies of the neoconservatives in America. You have Bannon, you have Cummings, you have these fabulous and weird and discombobulating think tanks who are driving the debate, and then you have the media, who are mainly owned by, you know, people like Murdoch, the Barclay brothers, people like that, and they also have a vested interest in promoting this ideology. It has absolutely no basis. So it's my own personal area of research is as you know, is exile and human rights. And what you create within this environment of this almost neo-fascist environment is you create a mythology of purity. So you basically promote a framework of us and them. It's very, very easy to do that. But if you look into it, there's actually no substance to that, because who are we and who are they? And then it's very, very easy to demonize certain groups from within the population. You do that, and then you saw what happened yesterday, and you saw what happened with Brexit, and you saw what happened with the re-election of, you know, we've had the Conservative governments now for 10 years uninterrupted, which again is another product of disenfranchising people and that continuous propaganda and brainwashing. Why it's absolutely dizzying. I mean, I wouldn't even go into it. The misery that he has brought to people, as we heard earlier. It's the Windrush generation. I have friends, as you know, most of my life was spent in and around London. Lots and lots of friends, either British-born, London-born, Londoners, or Jamaican-born, who don't even know whether they're coming or going. Other people have lost their parents to this, ended up, with serious illnesses, disentitled from healthcare and things like that. And then now you're seeing it again with EU citizens. So again, you've got another wave of that about to begin next year. God, I don't know what we're looking forward to. 2021 is going to be an interesting year.
Sorry, as Effie says, Ken, it's classic diversion tactics. When the economy is failing, and people aren't feeling well-resourced, well-supported, they're feeling bereft of meaningful opportunity for them and their children, then it has to be somebody's fault. And when it's Westminster's fault, what better routine than to blame other? Because essentially it is about other. It's not about really where the immigration has come from. It's about that it wasn't from here. And as Effie pointed out, who amongst us is in a position to say that we are uniquely in possession of some preferential genetics or culture? Scotland is founded on being a welcoming environment. It welcomed my parents to this country, and it's a very interesting dynamic. When you're out on the doorsteps and you're campaigning, as I do for the SNP and for independence, you'll get this immigration question actually mercifully and frequently. And people will talk, and they see a white guy with a Scottish accent, and they think that gives them carte blanche to vent some of the slightly more less palatable views on immigration. And I'll ask them, do you mean like me? Because my parents came to this country in search of work and a better life. Oh no, not you, somebody else. It's always somebody else. And it's paper thin, and it's based on fear. And countries that are better managed than the United Kingdom is by Westminster don't suffer this level of hostility to others.
And Dave, I just wondered, in your constituency and amongst the kind of people that you're in touch with, like you say, have you found that there is a concern about this, and is there a particular demand perhaps for not immigrant labour in your constituency?
There absolutely is. In Angus, we have a very high quality, high performing agricultural sector which demands seasonal labour. And that's not a point of view, that's an absolute fact. It's not just berries is an easy one because it's such a high demand for labour during harvest that it's easy. It's the one that usually gets picked up on. But in actual fact, European labour is prevalent across most of agriculture, particularly in the processing side. People think when they talk about agriculture, they tend to think, because it's just, you tend to think about a farm. But in actual fact, the amount of value add and input that goes from a plant or an animal product as it leaves the farm before it gets to the packet in your supermarket and on much less into your house is huge. And that involves an enormous amount of labour. Much of it is Eastern European. So it's a hugely self-defeating thing. But I'm always heartened by the infrequency with which this comes up from ordinary people, because ordinary people aren't stupid; they get it. And this nonsense about having these jobs open to British workers. Well, we could do with higher wages in Angus, but we've actually got relatively low unemployment, as we do across most of Scotland. Unemployment is not the problem. The level of remuneration for much of the employment that we do have is the problem. And so there is not thousands and thousands of people waiting to take these jobs. The economy is a little bit more sophisticated than that. And it's time politicians stopped banging on about releasing, as though they've been captivated, releasing these jobs for British workers is patently nonsense.
Yeah. Now, on a somewhat similar note, when we talk about racism in Britain, yesterday there were a series of events in London. It's hard to know quite what to call them. We saw some descriptions of them as counter-protesters. These were people in London allegedly there to protect statues, such as the statue of Churchill, from abuse by Black Lives Matter protesters. These were mostly older men, mostly white, and several were seen giving what appeared to be Nazi salutes. Now, Effie, what do you make of this kind of event, this kind of gathering that we saw in London yesterday?
Well, it was tragically reminiscent of, the late Weimar Republic of the mid-30s in Germany. There was a lot of that, visually at least, when you've looked into that era, as I and many other people have, and all these images are available on Google, the fury and the sort of unmitigated anger was something that shocked me deeply, and it does every time I look at images like this. What was interesting about yesterday is I don't quite understand what they were protesting against, because they have a government now, a large majority, God knows how that happened, who support the ideals and the causes that they espouse. So what was it exactly that they're angry about? Perhaps you could enlighten me. I mean, Kenny, because, I actually get literally sometimes, I think, am I going to burst an artery when I see these scenes? You have things that happen. Obviously, we've seen the scene with the urinating man and all this stuff. And most of them are drunk and most of them are bare chested, and the abuse that goes with it. Some of them also volunteer some historical events, like, for example, that Churchill killed Hitler. That was another interesting novelty in history that we might have to add to Wikipedia. It's very much about, as Dave said very succinctly, it's about othering. It's about creating an environment where there is such thing as a pure me and a very impure other. And then once you've done that, it's very, very easy to find groups who are willing to go out and commit any crime, any form of abuse, violence of the highest kind, in order to protect something that they have been told is in danger. Now, I don't understand. The government is this is their government. The people who represent them, they're in power. What was it actually? What was the purpose of yesterday's disgusting scenes? I perhaps you could enlighten me, and maybe David can enlighten us.
I wish I could. Dave, when you look at these kind of this kind of event that happened yesterday in London, people confronting the police, as Effie said, a lot of anger, a lot of kind of violent impulses from a side that a group of people who you would think as she says, has broad support from the government. What is it that you think that these people were trying to get across?
Well, I mean, that level, I listened to what Effie was saying, and I share her concern and bewilderment about the logic. I would venture that seeking for logic in some of the, or rational, these are not rational responses. These are in some ways opportunistic, insofar as there's an opportunity for conflict, and these people, for whatever reason, appear to seek out and feed off conflict. But the anger and the rage isn't caused by the Black Lives Matter movement or the current dialogue and discussion that we're having, very important, I believe, over the validity of some of these statues in the modern world. The situation and the broader discussion and dynamic that's underway just now is the trigger. The anger was there already. This is just the release for that anger, an opportunity to vent it. Because it seems to me, and as I say, caveat this with this is way above my pay grade of understanding the human condition, but many people are trapped in low-wage jobs in communities that only contain low-wage jobs. Some of whom are long-term unemployed. There's a lack of ambition, there's a lack of opportunity, which can manifest itself in hopelessness and fatigue and risk-taking behaviours. And these things all start to feed off each other until you end up with what can emerge as just very, very angry people who always, seems to me, go for the soft target to blame, rather than actually looking, in the event that that's possible, to look at the structural conditions that have prevailed in the United Kingdom over the last 40 years, which have resulted in them, their family and their communities being in such negative circumstances and causing that anger. So I think it's probably a mistake to connect the cause with the effect and make sure that and say that the Black Lives Matter movement is the cause. I think the cause is much deeper and longer term than that, and what we're seeing is a release, an opportunistic release for this rage and discontentment. But that's by no means an excuse. I mean, the behaviour is just unbelievable. But I mean, I think the people in the UK government and the UK establishment, they're no more allied to these people than you or I are. But they're useful sometimes for the broader narrative, and they like some of the headlines that Effie's pointed out in some of her British newspaper titles that seem to they wend and weave this quite successfully in the interests of sales and promoting their own narrative by association.
Now, Dave, this might be quite a big question to answer in just a couple of minutes, but we see these people kind of talking about how proud they are to be British, and there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that concept, I don't think. But when we look back to, for example, the 19th of September back in 2014, we saw these same Nazi salutes in George Square from people from the No campaign. We see these Nazi salutes now from people who are protecting a statue of Churchill. What is it about Britishness, do you think, that makes people so confused about what it is they're trying to celebrate?
You're right. That is a big question, and I think I'm not certain. I'm not here to stand up for the British state or British culture or anything else, or make a judgment on it. I think whether it's in George Square or whether it's in central London or wherever it manifests itself, I think the historical context, insofar as they underpin this action at all, are the most tenuous possible. And in actual fact, I think the whole Nazi salute in front of a statue of Churchill really actually serves to highlight the inherent contradiction in much of what they're expounding, which is really, it's just anger. It's anger, and it's attached to the promotion and maintenance of their version of Britain, which I think is probably, thankfully, not universally the case, and also an avenue, a safety valve, if you want, It's not a very attractive safety valve for this pent-up aggression and anger that they have. And in Scotland, of course, it's overlaid with an additional dynamic in terms of sectarian concerns and also the constitution. So it's kind of turbocharged a little bit in that way, but much of it is not really British nationalism. It's I would say it's more in keeping with extreme English nationalism.
Well, speaking of British nationalism, English nationalism, something that was considered to be a major cause of Brexit, and looking at the Brexit situation this week, Effie, excuse me, we saw the Scottish and Welsh First Ministers writing to the government complaining about the fact that they've not been consulted at all during this process. We saw Michael Gove then announce that there would be no extension, that there was going to be no... excuse me. A wee bit of water went down the wrong way there. We saw Michael Gove basically announcing that there would be no attempt to agree a negotiation before agree an extension to the transition before the end of this month. This has left a lot of people extremely concerned, because it does leave just 6 months before we will leave the EU, and it doesn't look like there's going to be time during that 6 months to agree a deal. What do you make of this, and why do you think it is that, first of all, the UK government has excluded the devolved government so much, and secondly, why do you think even with the coronavirus crisis they're so resistant to the idea of extending the transition?
The UK government have been known to exclude devolved administrations historically. So this isn't new. The Westminster system, the British stroke. This is obviously a very complicated debate about the constitutionality of what's happening here, and the British stroke English constitution as it is applied and as recently reinterpreted by the courts following the events just before the election. So the constitution, as it were, as we have it at the moment, the UK constitution is a very centralised instrument. So obviously, you have devolved administrations, but a lot of this is known to be there simply for purposes of allaying the people of Scotland, be it Northern Ireland, be it even Wales, to believe that there is some kind of very high level significance to this. Yes, and we do obviously have areas where it's fantastic and it's working, and such things as the schools and all the things that we know about. But when it comes to the big constitutional questions, they are always administered by the Westminster government. And Brexit obviously is the highest of prices. This is why they're there. I'm not in the least bit surprised that they have refused it. Johnson has not made secret of the fact that vote for me and I'll get you out no matter what. We know of his links. They have been reported widely, and I'm not going to repeat here what has been said about who his friends are and the interests that they serve. Now, he is there to do this, and whenever they brought up the idea of a deal or remaining in the single market, any of those things, they were blatantly lying, and you could tell purely based on the contradictory nature of their statements at the time. You knew that this is what they actually wanted. They don't want a deal because they can't have a deal. The EU is not, and you're talking to someone who has, even anecdotally, my dad served in the Commission between 78 and 82. The EU will not dilute the integrity of the single market. It is something that's been built over the last 40 years. It is a very, very important instrument, and this will not be diluted. And the British government know this. So they're pushing, and they're also promoting the narrative, again, in order to build up the anger within the followers and the people who read their papers. They will not dilute the integrity of the single market. And let us not forget that European food, pharmaceuticals, water quality, environmental protections, they're even, I will go as far as to say they're the highest in the world. So you will not, the whole idea of Brexit was to deregulate that and get away from it. So we could be our own bosses somehow, which is another bit of madness. Now, this is what it has always been about. It was never going to happen. And there you have it. And it's about to happen in a few weeks' time. I mean, 20 weeks is literally, it's just round the corner. It's absolutely petrifying. The reality of this, even the people who are administering it and promoting it right now, they don't even know what's going to happen. It's going to be quite messy. So, God help us.
Yeah. And Dave, you've obviously been at Westminster while a lot of these discussions have been going on. Have you got any impression from the UK government that there has been any intention to even negotiate in good faith, or do you think this has always been the goal?
To negotiate in good faith with the EU or with the devolved administrations?
With the EU.
With the EU, no. I think they're having the most tremendous difficulty reconciling the reality, which they fully understand, of the dynamic between a Brexiting United Kingdom and the European Commission, and that which they're spinning through their friends in the media to the British people. The two things are completely incompatible, and the closer we get to actually exiting and at the end of the transition period, the closer we get to that stage, then the more acute that mismatch between rhetoric and actions becomes. So this is a very difficult period for them, and I think they have to keep this going. The lies and the spin and the double speak and the shape shifting and all this that's been going on for the last 5 years really, is coming to a head, and I think that, and I think most people accept this, is that they have set course to crash out with no deal at all, or such a deal of such minimal provision that it's as good as no deal in any way. And that will be so damaging for ordinary people, many of whom have been hoodwinked into voting for Brexit. I'll never forget the night when we had the Brexit referendum and the count came in. I think Sunderland was one of the first to come back, and they voted for Brexit. And I thought, if ever there was a part of the United Kingdom that had a lot to lose from leaving the EU, it's there. And if they voted for it, then this is gone. So no, I think it's very damaging, and I don't see any goodwill at all. And moreover, as the pressure ramps up on the UK executive and the ministers, then so the mask slips of any meaningful dialogue in this union of equals that we're supposed to be living through. And I have absolutely the utmost respect for the Welsh and Scottish governments for saying, you're not going to treat us like this.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dave, you were speaking out yesterday about the impact that's likely for the fishing industry, obviously a big part of the economy in your constituency. What is your fear about the situation for Scotland's fishing industry if there is no deal?
Mm-hmm. The first thing to make clear, Kenny, is that fishing, like everything to do with Brexit, it's never as simple as the papers like to make out. The papers just want us to see this dynamic where it's about taking back control of our waters. We catch all the fish, and that's all great. But it's so much more complex than that, with the different components of the fishing industry, the distant fleet, the pelagic fleet, the inshore fishers, the shellfish industry, the processors, the transporters. There's so much to it, and some of those interests are possibly competing depending on what conditions and negotiations our colleagues in the EU seek to impose, or seek to negotiate rather. But the scenario, the real problem that we've got, and we heard this in the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee just this week, is that if we crash out without a deal, then what happens to the colossal market for Scottish fish produce that the EU is? Does that market just close? Does it introduce tariffs and quotas under WTO? If we do get a deal, at what cost in terms of access to Scottish and UK waters? So there's lots to be transacted. And again, in terms of inconsistency, the high-level political rhetoric from ministers on this subject is so completely at odds with the technocratic complexities that the industry need to be reconciled very, very soon. We've got about 2 weeks to get this resolved before the 1st of July. And there's very, very little confidence that I can pick up on that we're putting our best foot forward in this respect. And so it's a very, very dangerous time at the moment because, consistent with much else that Scotland produces in terms of food and drink, our fish is of the highest order, particularly our shellfish, and it's in great demand in Europe. It's a success story. It underpins hundreds and hundreds of jobs at sea and on shore, and in transport and logistics and trading and marketing and everything else. And there's so much at stake here that belies the thinly veiled ideological rhetoric, which is all we hear from government ministers. It's very alarming.
Mm-hmm. And Effie, kind of tying all of the stories that we've been looking at this morning together, a lot of people who have come to Britain from the EU in the last 20, 30, even 40, 50 years will have felt that they were coming to somewhere that was home. This idea that is quite popular around the rest of the EU, that actually free movement's a good thing and that this ability to settle anywhere, we're all Europeans now kind of thing. And at the same time, people from the Windrush generation came to Britain believing that they were British.
Yeah.
People who came particularly from places like Jamaica, but also from the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere. They had been told that as colonial subjects, they were part of Britain. Of course. And they were British.
The idea of the Commonwealth. Yeah.
And being invited to Britain to work, that they would be welcomed. And then they got here and found that they weren't necessarily very welcome. What do you think about the situation in Britain where, as we've talked about a little bit, this kind of English nationalism that we're now seeing is in many ways a very white nationalism? What do you make of this as an ongoing thread through British culture?
It's interesting because free movement, the Britons, or rather say the English, have always loved free movement, but they perceived it as applying to themselves. So they literally helped themselves to, I think, about 2/3 of world territories and wealth just by making themselves welcome in every territory where they landed. And through that time, the last maybe, I'd say about 400 years since they started with Elizabeth I, around about the time of the big Spanish Empire as well, a narrative has been woven as to the goodness and the benefits of being led, out of your sort of blind indigenous, a little bit kind of, infantile civilization and into the more sophisticated sort of English ways of, that obviously included the language and the different ways of being and everything else, and aligning yourself with English, with Englishness, which then became, Britishness. And as you say, weaving that through centuries has had an impact, and people, have come to believe in, the beginning of the 20th century that they would be kind of very fortunate to be part of something like this. And let's not forget that, the wealth that came from that is what actually built what we understand to be Britain today. Be it, the connection with Africa, with the East Asia, with, South America and Canada and Australia and all these places. So yeah, absolutely. There was a deeply entrenched belief that you were very lucky to be part of this big, Britannia, this big, wonderful idea of inclusiveness and almost like a kind of a higher level civilization civilization, an understanding of the human condition, which was slightly better than anybody else's. And we all know about, how make, sometimes fun of the Europeans or the Frenchies or the Germans or the this or the that. And likewise with the as you said, the Indian subcontinent, the people from the Caribbean. I have connections with the Jamaican community from my time in London. So on arrival here, especially over the last, maybe, I will go as far as to say since the Thatcher years, but Thatcher was... that was a different time. It was never that blatant I was a very small child, but, from what I can kind of remember from that time. It then, weirdly enough, during the Blair government, it became a bit of an issue. I don't know if you remember the discussion, we have to be open about immigration. So that was kind of the beginning, at least for me, to with this. And then you have Theresa May at the Home Office, and that is the decisive moment. This is when consciously, that you've got Murdoch going in there with his own very personal racism. You have the Barclay brothers. You have the Daily Mail, who at the time had espoused Hitler. Let's not forget. Let's not forget that the cover page and all that stuff and all that. And then you have again made it part of new British English culture. So now an Englishman is free and proud to talk about this stuff as if this were his entitlement, it was his right to do so. Recreating that, I think, is going to be very, very dangerous. There will be no good ending to this. Don't get me wrong; it never ends well when you begin that. When you begin that, and we've had historical moments where nations or countries or groups have believed in themselves in this kind of mythological way. It will not end well. How it's going to end, we don't know. And whether over the next 10 years, we in Scotland are going to be part of this debate. Hopefully, there'll be a moment when we decide that this isn't great. But my understanding historically is that it hasn't worked out generally if people, go down that path.
Well, we do move on now to talk a little bit about how the country is responding to the coronavirus crisis. And this week there has been a big discussion about how far apart we should be. Now, obviously, Effie, you and I are at least 2 meters apart here. But there's been a big stooshy this week. A lot of people asking why it shouldn't be reduced to 1 meter. This is something that some of the politicians in England have talked about. It does seem that the scientific advice they're receiving is that maybe 1 meter is okay.
The First Minister gets asked about this on a regular.
Well, that's something I was going to bring up. But the First Minister obviously has said that still the advice in Scotland is to stay 2 meters apart. Dave, our producer here has kept pointing out the inverse square law. Now, this is fairly obvious to anybody who's worked with lighting, for example, that you get double the distance, you get much less light, you get twice as far away from somebody. Obviously, their breath is going to be a bit more diffuse. Why do you think that the UK government is so keen to, if not ignore the science, then at least find the science that suits them best?
Well, it's quite clear is because of the pressure that's on to allow almost, if not all, of the economy to open up again. The ability to allow, for example, the hospitality, the entertainment sector to open up with 2 meter social distancing is almost nil. And we know for a fact that the Treasury are putting enormous pressure on the rest of government to get people back to work and to get the economy moving again. The figures around the UK economy are absolutely shocking, and we need to, unfortunately, we're part of the UK economy, and we need to brace ourselves for what that means here in Scotland too. But it's the pressure to get the economy back moving. And incidentally, I can't remember who it was. I think it was one of the UK government's scientific advisors was talking about the clinical difference between standing 1 meter away from somebody and 1 meter and 2 meters away. And it is, it's not double. It's way more than double safer to be 2 meters away. But to be quite truthful, I'm not certain 1 metre is social distancing. Maybe I'm just a bit standoffish. I don't like to stand within 1 metre of very many people. That's far too close for comfort. So personal space is a good thing, COVID here or there. But I think that's the pressure. And I would suggest actually that 1 metre isn't really actually social distancing, unless you're on, for example, a train or a bus or something like that. Mm-hmm. But that's the pressure that we're under, and the Scottish Government is under enormous pressure as well. I think a business and at a business level and at an individual level, the behaviour scientists and the sociologists and everything else like that are tremendously surprised and impressed at people's ability to have conformed to the most incredible lockdown restrictions on personal freedoms and movement, and we've all done this tremendously well. But we're now moving into, we've contained and reduced the numbers that we're seeing very, very well. And so, whilst I'm not in any rush to see the social distances reduced needlessly, if we can keep these numbers going in the right direction, then we need to look at what the next. Well, Scottish Government are all over this, and they've set out their phases for which to do this. But it will impact here in Scotland as well, whether or not we take the same steps as ministers in London are taking. That I'm doubtful, but we'll make sure that there's a process and that the phases are further tailored to suit the conditions that we've got in Scotland, and that's what we'd expect our Scottish Government to do. Yeah.
Now, Effie, you mentioned the barrage of questions that the First Minister has faced on this issue. On Friday there, 4 different media outlets found a different way to ask whether 2 metres was better than 1 metre and why wasn't the First Minister doing the same things that they were talking about in England. What does it say about the media in Scotland and the UK that there seems to be more intention to get a gotcha question, to get the First Minister, or in some cases the Cabinet in London, to trip up on a question rather than to investigate what the science says and to present that information to the public? It's
not great, is it? It's not a great. It's not really to their credit. This is more about sensationalism, really, than it is about investigative journalism. You're not going to get an insight into anything if you're simply trying to get people to simply just strip up, or in some instances create a popularity contest. And I think the First Minister was blatantly open about this. She said this is not a popularity contest, and I completely support her in saying this, because this is about this is a life and death situation. This isn't about who's gonna be more pleasing, or who's gonna align themselves, as Dave rightly said, more with industry and what they expect, and how soon the hospitality industry is going to be open. And we know that large sectors of the economy do depend on the hospitality industry. But in terms of journalism, sadly, I think there was a poll a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it, where was it British journalists are believed now to be the least credible of a number of nations. I think it was European and further afield. And there is a reason for that. Through the whole of the last maybe 6 or 7 years, there's been a narrative of an exclusionary narrative, an entitled narrative has been building up within, mostly, within the BBC, but also the papers, the sort of the more right-wing papers in England who support this. But sadly in Scotland, you've got some lone voices, your good self included, but again, you don't have a big, large structure where you would look to say, okay, you know what, X is doing great. Again, you've got this thing where they're following a more sensationalist, populist approach, as opposed to looking for the truth, which is what they really, I think, their duty. I mean, you tell me what your duty is, but isn't this the duty of a journalist or someone sort of reporting, or as opposed to creating simply big headlines?
Yeah, I mean, certainly our view is that our job is to report the truth as best we can.
Yeah, and you've been doing great. But, who else? I mean, obviously not naming names, but I can't actually, there are, as I said, lone voices here and there.
Yeah.
Great, you can say, oh, this person or that person. But in terms of big institutions, I really don't know where to look.
Yeah, and Dave, just quite quickly, what's been your take on how the media has handled this whole coronavirus crisis?
Well, coronavirus is a very difficult thing for the media, for the printed media, or many elements of the printed media, to report upon. Or they could have done, I absolutely agree with Effie, they could do an awful lot more about the underlying dynamics and an awful lot less about the personalities. Although, in terms of Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock, there is a lot of reporting that could be done there. The First Minister, I think, by any honest assessment, and her colleagues in government, particularly Jean Freeman, they've done an outstanding job in very difficult circumstances. The fact that we are not a sovereign state with control over treasury powers has been airbrushed out of this discussion, as though as a devolved element of the United Kingdom we can just do what we like in the run-up to the COVID crisis. We had to cooperate with London, whether we liked it or not. There was no way around that. So given those significant impediments on our freedom for movement, I think the Scottish Government has received a lot of respect from people in Scotland, and that hasn't gone down very well with elements of the media, as we can see. And so there's a concerted effort to try and wrong foot, And that's nothing new. We're used to that in Scotland. In terms of, I was interested to hear Effie say that it's unclear where to go for that line. I increasingly look to foreign titles, and I'm very happy to reference foreign titles to see, because apart from anything else, it's quite good to see how other people view you as well, because the view from outside the bubble is sometimes quite revealing as well. So I would encourage people to do that, as well, obviously, as referencing the outstanding news that we get in the National as well. So it's the media, but I started answering your question, Karen, by saying how it's difficult for the printed media because COVID is complex, and complexity does not sell newspapers. Banal headlines sell newspapers increasingly. And if I was being devil's advocate for just a second, the pressure on editors and journalists in the printed media side is enormous. These titles, even very, very big titles, we saw just last month, the Sun is now declining to communicate or reveal its circulation figures. Good. Yeah. And because they're obviously, I assume they don't want their advertisers to know what they are. So there's very, very significant pressure on printed newspapers to sell newspapers. People get their news in so many different ways now. Yeah.
Well, given the absolutely shocking headline that the Sun put on its front page on Friday, I have to say I wouldn't be sorry if their readership shrunk just a wee bit. But we move on now, and this week and last week on our Friday shows, we have been talking about building Scotland better coming out of this crisis. And on Friday there, we had a great conversation with Ronnie Cowan MP and with Cleo Goodman from the Citizens Basic Income Network Scotland about universal basic income. And Dave, this is something that the First Minister said to us on Friday. She's gone from being interested in the idea to very supportive of it. It's something that has become basically US SNP policy during this crisis, that at the very least there should be an emergency basic income introduced, if not this trial that's proposed in Scotland to be facilitated. What's your interest in UBI like? Are you like the First Minister, or had Ronnie Cowan got in your ear before that?
hesitate to compare myself to the First Minister in any way, shape or form, such as the level that she operates at. But no, the dynamic is similar, Kenny. This was not something I was particularly cited on until Ronnie and others expounded its virtue. That, combined with the genuinely harrowing cases I've got from constituents in Angus who have been completely hung out to dry by a completely dysfunctional benefit system that is as meagre as it is complex, as it is slow and lumbering, based not on efficiency or support, but rather ideology, and the basis that if you're not providing for yourself for whatever duration of time, then you'll take what you get and you'll be happy with it. It's just, it's been, as you know, obviously as an MP, I have to deal with the Department of Work and Pensions on behalf of my constituents, and it's been a very rapid eye-opener to the, sometimes abject heartache that people have to endure at the hands of, I would suggest actually it's a dysfunctional department operating a dysfunctional system. And to what end as well? Because the beauty of UBI is where it concentrates support and where that support gets spent in the economy. I think if you're operating and seeking to be a just and fair society that looks out for everybody, rather than being obsessed on the tiny minority of people who will almost certainly, there has to be a minority of people, well, it doesn't have to be, but there almost inevitably will be a minority of people who will take advantage and to some way or extent abuse what is there for the benefit of everybody. But we have to, as a society and as communities, get beyond that and look to the greater good. If you look at some of the things that are deemed affordable by this United Kingdom government, such as Trident replacement and HS2 and vanity projects up and down Hinckley B power station, Crossrail, you name it. None of them particularly are supportive at all for Scotland. These things are all deemed to be affordable by many people in Scotland too, I can assure you, from conversations I've had on the doorsteps in the run-up to the election. So why is UBI not affordable either, given the tangible, manifest and immediate benefits it will have for every single community across these islands?
Yeah. And Effie, just quite quickly, what's your feeling about a UBI? Do you think there is scope for this to happen anytime soon?
Oh, absolutely. There was scope to bail out the bankers to the extent of just under $1 trillion. So, and we were okay with that. No one ever complained because it was not put forward as an issue. It was just obviously, taken as a natural thing to do. There is scope fiscally and institutionally. There is definitely scope. The problem is here, as David points out, is ideology, and it's the moralizing and the stigmatizing of poverty, and poverty is needed. If you get large numbers of people who are poor, then what you have is masses of people more easily controlled. So if you lift people out of poverty, then they become more critical, they become more educated, and this is not something that an authoritarian regimes like. So UBI, absolutely, and obviously it's a very, very complex issue. There are different ways of doing it. There are different ways of looking at it, and many studies have been done on this, but it is more of an ideology related problem than it is a reality or a fiscal issue. There is scope, and we really should be looking to implement something like this very, very soon.
Yeah. And finally today, we mark 3 years since the fire at the Grenfell Tower, a tragedy that killed several people, and a tragedy that we are still trying to kind of move past or to learn from. The Labour Party said today that there are still 56,000 people sleeping in homes that have the similar type of cladding. And the Fire Brigades Union reported today that it's pretty much a lottery whether you live in an area that has the facilities to combat a fire in one of these towers. Dave, what's your feeling about where we are 3 years after Grenfell? Do you think we've learned anything yet?
well, I think we have learned very hard lessons that cost 72 people their lives about the combustibility and the effect that that particular material on the outside of large tower blocks has on the fire services accepted methods of, or previously accepted methods of protecting people in such circumstances, and how these almost certainly have had to be reviewed. They've been very painful lessons for not clearly for families who have paid, whose family members have paid the ultimate price. But for the firefighters, I can only imagine as well. Second to that, the firefighters who are there unable. That's their job. They do it all the time, save lives and protect people. And they found themselves that night unable to do so. And I'm talking about the ordinary firefighters on the ground. So we have learned valuable lessons, but of course the pace of renewal and removal of these is nothing like appropriate. It's a very challenging situation that we face in terms of how to make these buildings safe as they possibly can be, and as expedient a way as possible for the reassurance and safety of the people who live in them, and that work needs to pick up pace.
Mm-hmm. And Effie, a really just similar question to you. What do you think we've learned in these last 3 years since the fire?
I would just echo what Dave just mentioned. Hard lessons, tragic lessons, but also the pace at which this is moving in terms again of central government, UK government. Really, I'm seeing there's no encouraging signs at all that they're willing to confront what's happened and correct it. So again, we've got these buildings. There are a number of them, as you said. Nothing really of any significance has happened. And another one of these tragedies may well happen again. Although I hate to say this, but there is nothing to suggest that significant steps have been taken to stop it. So a sad day, for that particular community, and also a day to reflect on events and reminisce a little bit. Yeah, we do obviously send our sympathies to those families and our best wishes to campaigners who are trying to make sure that something like that can never happen again. But that is sadly all we've got time for today. So I'd like to thank Effie for joining me in the studio, and Dave for joining us on Skype. It's a pleasure to talk to both of you. And we would like to thank you at home for joining us as well. There wouldn't be any point in making the shows if we didn't have an audience. So thank you very much. If you are able to support Broadcasting Scotland, then we would please encourage you to do so. If you go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up as a supporter, then your £5 a month makes a big difference here. First of all, it lets us keep the lights on, make sure that we can keep producing these shows. But any extra money that comes in, it all goes into producing new shows, different kinds of shows, and improving the quality of the service that we can offer here. We want to build a full service broadcaster, the kind of broadcaster Scotland deserves. And we can only do that with your help. So please, if you can, support us that way. If you can't, then we do understand. We've talked a little bit today about how difficult this period has been for all of us. So we do understand. But if you can find somebody else who can support us, then you've done more than enough. So please do share the shows around. Follow us on Twitter @BroadcastScot. Follow us on Facebook. And let people know why you support Broadcasting Scotland, why you watch us, why you think it's important that other people do support us financially. You can be our marketing team and our fundraising team, and that's as big a part of this as the people who do actually put their hands in their own pockets. And finally, if you want to get involved here, that's another thing where we do need some extra hands. There's lots of work to be done, especially as we do start now to move towards exiting lockdown. We will be able to have more people coming into the studio, more people coming in to work here. So if there's anything you want to do that's involved in producing television programmes, then please do get involved with us, whether it's behind the camera or in front of the camera. There's lots to be done here, and we're more than willing to provide training, or if you have skills, maybe you're retired or between jobs and you'd like to just keep your skills sharp,
then do come in, let us know what you can do, and we will find a place for you. But as I say, that is absolutely all we've got time for. So once again, thank you to Effie Samara for joining us, and thank you to Dave Doogan MP. Hopefully we will talk to both of you again very soon. Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7 with Scotland at 7. I'll be back on Tuesday as usual with my Scotland at 7. But until then, have a wonderful Sunday. Goodbye. Grant.